One of the most exciting elements of 2024 is that coming into every race, we genuinely didn't know who was going to be the fastest, and so I'm going to go through every single race to look at which team had the fastest car the most. Now keep in mind, having the fastest car in the most races might not necessarily mean that you have the outright best car for the entire season, because there is also the question of how consistent your car was, even when you weren't the fastest. In terms of my criteria, I definitely have a bias towards race pace, because even though there are some tracks where you have to prioritize quali pace to get track position, more often than not, the race is what matters most, because that is where you can make the biggest difference. To an extent, I will also take into account what both of the drivers were able to extract from the car, but at the same time, 2024 saw some pretty wide performance deficits between teammates, and as is the case in motorsport, the performance of the car is always determined by what the fastest driver is able to get out of it. The start of the season was almost a continuation of 2023, and in Bahrain it was Red Bull domination. They qualified first and fifth, winning the race with a 1-2, with Max going on to finish 47 seconds ahead of the next non-Red Bull. Saudi Arabia was more of the same. Red Bull again utterly dominated in both qualifying and also the race, with Max this time being only 31 seconds ahead of the next non-Red Bull. Australia is the first interesting race of the season because even though Sainz went on to win after coming back from surgery, the Red Bull was still the outright fastest car. Max qualified on pole with Checo in third before he had to take a grid penalty, and had Max not suffered the brake issue, there is absolutely no doubt that he would have gone on to win that race. What's interesting about Japan is that because in 23 we were there at the end of the season and this year we were there at the start, it didn't even feel like it had been that long since we last raced there. Just like in 23, Red Bull were totally dominant. They qualified 1-2 and then in the race, it was business as usual with a 1-2 and Max 32 seconds ahead of the next non-Red Bull. China then did shake the order up a little bit with Lando taking pole for the sprint in wet conditions, but that was inconsequential as Max easily won the sprint, then qualified 1-2 with Checo for the race, and won the race ahead of Lando by 13 seconds. Finally, we get to the start of the actual season. Even though Max started on pole, during the opening stint, despite the fact that he didn't have the full upgrade, Oscar was able to comfortably stay within 3 seconds of Max the entire time. When Lando then got track position with the help of a safety car, in 25 laps, Max wasn't able to get anywhere near him as Lando built up a lead of over 7 seconds, and so overall McLaren had the best car. And now Imola is definitely one of those where you can give it to either Red Bull or McLaren because the margins were unbelievably tight. The top 3 in quali with Max on pole and the 2 McLarens behind him were separated by less than a tenth. However, Max got a monster tow down the straight from Nico Hülkenberg, and data confirmed that that made the difference to give him pole. In the race, the superior tyre wear of the McLaren saw huge fluctuations in pace, with Max being stronger on the mediums and Lando being stronger on the hards, especially as the stint went on. Max won by just 7 tenths after a massive chase from Lando as the tyres started to fall off, and to me, that is why McLaren was slightly the better car. Track position was everything around Imola, and without that tow, I am not sure that Max would have been on pole position and then had the pace, especially on the hards, to finish as close as Lando did. In Monaco, it was finally the turn of Ferrari. You've always got to account a little bit for that Leclerc-Monaco magic, but even so, Ferrari managed to qualify first and third, and then the race was basically meaningless because the Perez K-Mag crash allowed everyone to pit under the red flag, and so there was literally no overtaking and no pit stops, meaning everyone finished exactly where they qualified. Canada is by far the most difficult race to definitively say who had the fastest car because, in my opinion, Red Bull, Mercedes and McLaren all had a car capable of winning. In Canada, we saw the closest qualifying session of the year as George and Max set identical times with Lando Norris, only 21 hundredths behind in third place. On pure speed, all of them had the car to win the race in the wet, but as the track started to dry out, the McLaren clearly had the edge as Lando overtook both Max and George to lead the race by lap 21. It was only a McLaren strategy error that then dropped him down to third, and given that on the slicks he was then able to again overtake George and close up to Max, I'm going to give the edge to McLaren. In Spain, Lando himself admitted that McLaren had the fastest car, and after grabbing his first pole position of the season, it was only his start that cost him the win. The Red Bull was definitely good enough to also win that race. I mean, by no means did Max have a terrible car, but once again McLaren's ability to be kinda on its tyres allowed Lando to close a big gap after his last pit stop to lose out by just 2.2 seconds at the line. Had Lando led at the end of lap 1 and had clean air, I think he would have had more than enough pace to keep Max from striking distance. And next up was Austria, and a race where Red Bull were the fastest. Similar to Leclerc in Monaco, there is always a bit of Verstappen-Austria magic that you have to account for, but he was fastest in sprint qualifying, he won the sprint, he grabbed a pole position by 4/10 around the shortest lap of the calendar, which is an absolute joke, and the only reason he came under pressure, which then led to his crash with Lando, is because the team gave him a very slow pit stop of 6.5 seconds. Silverstone is another tricky one because although Mercedes locked out the front row and so definitely had a car capable of winning, by lap 20, both of the McLaren drivers had overtaken everyone and were running 1-2. It was then yet another McLaren strategy disaster class that totally ruined Oscar's race when they decided not to double stack him, and then they also waited a lap too long with Lando also making a mistake in the pits, which again cost them track position. To me, if you are running 1-2 and overtake everyone after 20 laps, there is no excuse not to be winning with either of your drivers. Hungary was the first truly dominant race from McLaren with a 1-2 in qualifying, and then despite a little bit of controversy in the middle, they managed to convert that into a 1-2 with Oscar 16 seconds ahead of the next non-McLaren. Spa was once again one of the closest races in terms of performance between Mercedes, McLaren and Red Bull. This was a race where the frontrunners really struggled to catch and overtake each other with track position being critical, hence why Mercedes were able to take the win. Having said that, it's important to remember that before Max had to take a 10-place grid penalty, he qualified on pole for this race by almost 6/10, with Checo in third. And now, if Checo is qualifying in third at this point of the season, it clearly shows that Red Bull had more than enough raw pace. Max in the end recovered to fourth, just 8 seconds behind the race leader, and had Max started the race where he should have started from pole position, there is no doubt in my mind that he would have gone on to win in the Red Bull. In Zandvoort, it was all McLaren. Lando qualified on pole by 4/10, which around there was extremely impressive, and although he lost the lead at the start, he would go on to have a dominant race, winning by almost 23 seconds. In Monza, Leclerc won by pulling off an audacious one-stop strategy, but it was definitely McLaren who had the faster car. They qualified 1-2 before a messy lap 1 put Leclerc into second. However, after the first round of pit stops, they were effectively back to running 1-2. Leclerc at the time basically had nothing to lose in trying the one-stop, and to his credit he made it work, despite a very strong charge and lots of pressure from the McLarens with Oscar and Lando just 2 and 6 seconds behind him respectively. Baku was another close one between Ferrari and McLaren. Leclerc got the better of Piastri in qualifying, however in the race, McLaren had better tyre wear as the stint went on and also had better race pace. During the opening stint, Leclerc wasn't able to shake Piastri before on lap 20, Oscar took the lead. On the hard tyres, McLaren's advantage over Ferrari only got bigger, and in the end, Oscar managed to win the race by a comfortable margin of over 10 seconds. With pole position by 2/10 and then the race win by 20 seconds, as well as Oscar on the podium in third, it was yet another dominant display by both Lando as well as McLaren. Even though Ferrari got out-qualified by both Max and Lando for the race, they definitely had the superior race car. After Leclerc took the lead at turn 1, he was able to just extend that gap in clean air pretty easily, with even Carlos managing to undercut Verstappen to give Ferrari a 1-2. Leclerc would finish almost 20 seconds ahead of the next non-Ferrari, although that gap was slightly exaggerated after both Lando and Max lost time with their on-track antics, which also gave Lando a 5-second penalty. In Mexico, Carlos and Ferrari were in perfect harmony. Even though Carlos lost pole position when Max overtook him into turn 1, the Ferrari had more than enough pace to allow Sainz to retake the lead, and from there it was a relatively comfortable win despite some late pressure from Lando. Although McLaren didn't take the Grand Prix win in Sao Paulo, they definitely had the faster car. They qualified 1-2 for the sprint and had a big enough gap to swap the cars in the sprint. Lando also then went on to grab pole position, and in the end, it was a mixture of bad timing as well as really poor race execution from both of their drivers that cost them the win. For the first time in 2024, Mercedes, with the help of cooler conditions in Las Vegas, were genuinely dominant. Even though qualifying came down to just 1/10, the race is where they excelled. Hamilton recovered from 10th to 2nd after a poor qualifying, and George comfortably won the race by almost 12 seconds ahead of the next non-Mercedes. Qatar was another very close one yet again between McLaren and Red Bull. Early in the weekend during the sprint, it seemed like McLaren was comfortably ahead, but with Parc Fermé being open before qualifying, Max and Red Bull definitely found something overnight that gave them the edge. Although he had to serve a one-place grid penalty, Max claimed pole by a narrow margin of 500ths ahead of George, and with how difficult it was to overtake in the race, once he jumped George at turn 1 and had clean air for the rest of the race, it was never really in doubt after that. And finally we get to Abu Dhabi in what was almost a flawless weekend for McLaren. They qualified 1-2 with Lando ahead of Oscar, and although Oscar being spun out by Max at turn 1 added a little bit of uncertainty in the fight for the constructors, at the front Lando was in total control as he won the race by over 5 seconds. All of that means that when it comes to the overall score, that makes it 1 for Mercedes, 3 for Ferrari, 8 for Red Bull, and 12 for McLaren. And now I think with all of these you can probably shift around 2 or 3 races that were really close between each of these teams, but for the most part this feels about right for what I saw this season. I look forward to seeing what you guys make of these results, and I'm sure you're also going to let me know what you would change compared to my list in the comments below. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.